Hey, welcome to the Eddie Hyatt Podcast. I am your host and teacher, Eddie Hyatt, and I'm so glad to be back with you today as we continue our exciting journey through the book of Acts. I felt that yesterday, I personally was very edified from yesterday's episode where I was talking about how Paul began the first church in Europe with a group of praying women there in Philippi, and how a woman named Lydia, that her house became the base of Paul's operations and became the meeting place for the first church in Europe. Yes, the first church that we have any record of in Europe. It met in the home of a successful businesswoman by the name of Lydia. And I want to elaborate on this just a little bit more and to confirm that yes, it was the meeting place for the church. By the way, New Testament church is not a building. New Testament church is people gathered together. Um, there is no historical record of a church building being built uh, as a church building for the first 200 years of the church's existence. Buildings with spires and stained glass windows are something from later church history. This kind of church architecture is unknown in the New Testament. The church was God's people gathered together. And there in Philippi, the first church in Europe, their gathering place was the home of a successful businesswoman by the name of Lydia. Now let's just read that again. And she was also the head of a household. And so, as we talked about yesterday, Paul met with a group of women in Philippi. There was not enough Jews for a synagogue, but there were a group of women who met together by the river every Sabbath to pray. And so Paul met with those women. He sat down and discussed with them and talked to them about Jesus and about the gospel. And verse 34 of Acts 16 says, "Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira." Purple it was a special dye. It was an expensive dye, and it was used for dyeing garments for royalty, for for aristocrats and royalty. And so she had relocated to Philippi, and uh, and it says the Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul, and when she and her household, she was the head of a household, she had a household, and I'll say it again. In the ancient world, a household was not a man and a woman and two or three kids. A household included servants, and depending on how wealthy they were, they could have hundreds of servants. Um, could be in-laws, grandparents who had come to live under their shelter, to be provided by them. It could include aunts, uncles. I mean, a household could be a very large group of people, and obviously, this woman had a large household. But it says that when she decided to follow the Lord and was baptized, her entire household. Here we have a mass conversion. What an incredible thing! And she and her household were baptized. And then Luke says she begged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." So she persuaded us. So she obviously had a large estate. She also already had a household, but now she was able to easily accommodate four grown men, because we know that in this party there was at least Paul, there was Silas, there was Timothy, and there was Luke. And so her home became the base of operations for Paul's ministry in Philippi, and also the meeting place for the church, the first church in Europe. This is confirmed at the end of Acts chapter 40. We'll talk about in a later episode how Paul and Silas are jailed after they cast a false prophetic spirit out of a young woman. They are they are beaten and jailed, but then God does a miracle. They're supernaturally released, and then the magistrates finally let them go. So, but listen to verse 40. So when they, that is Paul and Silas, when they went out of the prison, So they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. They departed Philippi. So where did they go? Where was their immediate destination when they were let out of jail? They went to Lydia's house. That was the meeting place for the church in Philippi. The first church in Europe was uh, was led by women, because Paul departs and he goes on his way. So there is no question that these women were among the leaders, uh, among the bishops and deacons that Paul greets in his letter to the Philippians. Because you see, years later, Paul wrote a letter to this same congregation. Yes, I'm sure that they had grown by this time and increased in numbers. But in his letter to the Philippians, in Philippians chapter 4, it's either verse 2 or 3. Let me just go over. I want to give you the exact verse so that you can follow up on it. Philippians chapter, it's actually Philippians chapter 4, verse 3. And he says, I encourage you, true companion, help those women who labored with me in the gospel. Notice he didn't say these women labored under me. He says that they labored with me. And uh, a well-known New Testament scholar, Greek scholar, Gerald Hawthorne, uh, for the Word Biblical Commentary, he produced the commentary on the book of Philippians. And he made this statement about Paul's words here in Philippians 4:3 to help those women who labored with me in the gospel. He says that in this passage that Paul used a metaphor which means to fight together side by side with. Help those women who labored side by side with me in the gospel, in the work of the gospel. Those women who labored at my side, they fought together side by side with me. And this clearly indicates that Paul saw these women not as peons under him, but as highly esteemed members of his team who had labored at his side in the cause of Christ. Now, before we close, I want to show you that this word labored, to labor in the gospel, it includes leading, it includes pastoring. Now, I think most would agree to labor in the gospel, it would include preaching, teaching. But I want to show you from the words of Jesus that it includes pastoring. And we see this in Matthew chapter 9, verse 38, where Matthew tells that Jesus went out and he saw the multitudes. And it says he was moved with compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They didn't know where to turn. They didn't know where to go. They were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, the Greek word for shepherd that Matthew uses here in Matthew 9:38 is the Greek word poimen. Most of the places it's translated as shepherd. But in one place, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, it's translated as pastor. So the New Testament pastor was a shepherd. The very same Greek word poimen is translated both shepherd and pastor in the New Testament. So think about this for a moment. Jesus was moved with compassion because the multitudes were like sheep without a shepherd, without anyone to show them the way to guide them. They were like sheep without a pastor. And so his response was, he said to the disciples, pray you therefore the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. So God sent laborers in answer to prayer would fulfill the need for shepherds and pastors. Do you see that? Jesus saw that the multitudes were scattered like sheep without a shepherd, without a pastor. And so he said to his disciples, pray the Lord of the harvest that he will send laborers into his harvest. God sent laborers would fulfill the need for pastors. because to labor in the gospel, it is an all-inclusive word that would include preaching, teaching, pastoring, helping, praying for, counseling, pastoring, shepherding. It is an all-inclusive word. Oh, may God raise up laborers today for the great harvest that is out there ready to be reaped. Are you one of those laborers that He is calling to go forth and to use the gifts that He has given you and placed in your lives? This is one reason that early Christianity exploded, because they did not shuttle women over into a corner. Yeah, if you get my book, it says women can't pastor. I have an entire chapter on that passage that is used so often in 1 Corinthians 14:34, where Paul said, "Let your women be silent in the churches." You need to understand that passage in the context of that letter in which it was written, to whom it was written, and understand the original language, and you will see a totally different picture that makes that verse line up with everything else that Paul said about women. And Paul said so many positive things about women, and he related to women as as equals, as companions, as co-laborers in the gospel. And oh, how the modern church needs to recapture that vision. That's why my book, Who Says Women Can't Pastor, is so very, very important. I hope you'll get a copy. Get a copy for your pastor, because pastors and leaders today, they need to be mobilizing the women, the God called women in their congregations. They need to be encouraging them and mobilizing them. And I'll close with that. That is so very important. Christian leaders today, male pastors, and even women pastors, they need to be not only God called men in their congregation, but they need to be encouraging, recognizing, and encouraging the God called women in their congregations. Only then will the church become a fully functioning body that will have an incredible impact upon this world. Hey, I'm Eddie Hyatt. This is the Eddie Hyatt Podcast. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. God bless you.